Welcome to the VCA Voice Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Marie Kerl. Join us as we dive into inspirational stories about our caring and capable associates and their commitment to guiding healing journeys for our patients. Our discussions explore the important ways VCA Animal Hospitals proactively supports the future of veterinary medicine through leading the industry in medical excellence and providing hometown care to our communities. Welcome to part one of our two-part series on the Recover 2.0 initiative on veterinary CPR. On today's episode, I'm happy to welcome our guests. Dr. Manuel Boller, who is the Internship Director at VCA Canada Central Victoria Veterinary Hospital in Vancouver, Canada, and also an Adjunct Associate Professor on the Faculty of Veterinary Medicine at the University of Calgary. Dr. Jamie Burkitt, who is an Associate Professor of Small Animal Emergency and Critical Care at the School of Veterinary Medicine, University of California, Davis. And Dr. Daniel Fletcher, Associate Professor of Emergency and Critical Care at the Cornell University College of Veterinary Medicine. All of our guests today are veterinary specialists, diplomates of the American College of Veterinary Emergency and Critical Care, and are co-chairs of the Recover Initiative. Hi, everybody. How you doing?
Hi.
Hi, fantastic. Thanks for having us.
Hey, Marie, very excited to be here.
I'm excited too. So we're going to jump right in with the first question, and I'll have each of you answer this, and we're going to start with Manu, but tell me briefly about your professional journey in veterinary medicine and also your current role.
Thanks very much. Yes, I'm born and raised in Switzerland, which is where the accent is coming from. I went to vet school at the University of Zurich in Switzerland and then also stayed on as a resident in anesthesia there because I really wanted to know the truth about how things are done in the proper way, so to say. And that's really during the anesthesia is where I fell in love with the cardiovascular system, with the respiratory system, and took a deep dive into the physiology thereof, and also was exposed to a lot of perioperative care of critical cases. And so then I thought, why don't you learn more about critical care? Mm-hmm. But at the time, there was nobody in Europe to allow such training. So I took the boat and went over to the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia to embark on a critical care residency. And once that was done, I thought like, oh, wow, resuscitation is really cool. So it just so happened that a group of resuscitation scientists came to Philadelphia at the Center for Resuscitation Science. And I was fortunate enough to obtain a fellowship there and at the same time also do a master's in translational research with the same group. And that's where my resuscitation career kind of took off. After that, nevertheless, went over to the University of Melbourne in Australia with my family to be on faculty at the University of Melbourne. And after having been there for 10 years, we moved over to Victoria on beautiful Vancouver Island, where I'm now working at a VCA Canada Specialty Referral Hospital as a critical care specialist.
Excellent. Dan, how about you?
I had a bit of a wavering path to veterinary medicine. My first career, I was an engineer, mostly because when I was in high school, my guidance counselor said, if you're good in math, you should be an engineer. And I said, okay, I'll do that. During my training as an engineer, as an electrical engineer, I got very interested in medicine and biology. And so I did a PhD in bioengineering to try to scratch that itch. But it turned out that wasn't enough. And as I was working on my PhD in bioengineering, I started volunteering at a place called the Marine Mammal Center in Sausalito, California, which is a rehabilitation center for seals and sea lions that strand on the California coast, and really got the clinical bug while I was there. So after I finished my PhD and did my postdoc, I was thinking about applying for faculty positions in engineering and decided that what I really wanted to do was to be a vet. So I went to vet school at UC Davis, which was a great experience for me. And then I really wanted to be a neurologist. And then I did my internship at the University of Pennsylvania and was corrupted there and fell in love with emergency and critical care medicine and decided to stay there and do my residency in emergency and critical care. And then when I finished that, I came to Cornell University to be on the faculty here. And I've been here since 2006, so 18 years, which is hard for me to believe.
Wow. You look so young.
Looks can be deceiving.
And Jamie, what about you?
Yeah. I also had a meandering path, really. As an undergraduate, I was sure I was going to be pre-med and volunteered at the Human Hospital for a while and ultimately decided that wasn't for me and decided instead to become a veterinarian. And I graduated from UC Davis in 2000 and then also did my small animal rotating internship at the University of Pennsylvania, where I entered sure that I either wanted to be a neurologist or an internist, and was also corrupted to emergency and critical care by that great.
And it sounds like the University of Pennsylvania will do that to you.
Yes, all three of us have passed through there one way or another, haven't we? And then I returned to UC Davis, where I did my small animal emergency critical care residency there. And I stayed there at UC Davis for a few years as a staff veterinarian and then a faculty member before going to private practice in 2008. And then from 2008 to 2016, I practiced in a variety of different emergency and specialty practices on the East Coast, and then in Texas and Oklahoma, and then back to the California Bay Area before joining back on the UC Davis faculty in 2017. And I've been there since then, and currently an associate professor of clinical small animal emergency and critical care there at UC Davis.
Dan, I really want to start talking a little bit about this work, and I'm very excited about this episode because we're focused on some groundbreaking work that the three of you have been leading, which is the Recover Initiative. Can you tell me what Recover stands for and give me a brief description of what it's about?
Sure. The Recover Initiative, we started back in about 2011. It stands for the Reassessment Campaign on Veterinary Resuscitation. So as you may have guessed, we came up with Recover first and then came up with some words to fill it in and make it work. And it was really started because I had a strong interest in teaching people how to do CPR in dogs and cats. There's a lot of standardized training available in human medicine. There really wasn't in veterinary medicine. And so I reached out to Manuel, who was the person I knew who knew the most about CPR and was doing active CPR research at that point, and asked him if he was willing to collaborate on a project to develop training materials. And basically his response was, I would love to do that, except that we really don't know how to do CPR in dogs and cats because no one's ever asked the question. And so we decided what we wanted to do was to develop evidence-based guidelines in the same way they do in human medicine and follow that same procedure to really develop specific guidelines around how best to do CPR in dogs and cats. And that's how this whole thing began.
Wow, that's wonderful. So Manu, tell me a little bit about the comparison of this to the evolution of CPR in human healthcare.
Thank you for that question. It's a really good one because when you look back in history, it's really interesting to learn that CPR as we know it today has first been invented in dogs. And the way it got about was basically an incidental finding. So what happened back in the 1950s in Baltimore at the Johns Hopkins University is that an engineer was working on developing defibrillation for dogs and used dogs as experimental animals at the time. And in order to deliver a shock, he had to push really hard on the pedals on either side. And those animals also had cardiovascular monitoring attached such that one could see the arterial pulse. And he noticed that when he pushes really hard on those pedals, that there was a blip on the arterial curve. And he thought like, oh, when I push on the chest, apparently I do something with the circulation. I generate a little bit of blood flow. And so then soon they realized that when they compress the chest on those animals, that they can then delay defibrillation by many, many minutes and still be successful with it, indicating that it keeps the heart in good shape if you do that, right? So there must be some flow. And then part of the same research group then was a human doctor, actually a surgical resident at the time, that thought, oh, that looks like makes sense. Let's try it on the clinical floor. And only then they started with closed chest compressions. Up until then, they actually opened everybody's chest with a blade in the human medicine world to do internal chest compressions. And that was basically the invention of closed chest compressions from dogs to man and not the other way around. So in a way, the animals served greatly to develop modern chest compressions. The birth time, I think, was 1960 is when that first paper was published really on closed chest compressions in humans. Before then, always open chest compressions only or internal chest compressions. And then, of course, it went on, right? In human medicine, it also had to overcome a barrier in acceptance, because what the ER doctors thought at the time is, you guys resuscitate all those people and then you bring them in as brain dead patients and we cannot really do anything about it. Why you even do that? There's no survivors, right? And it really took decades of development to come to an understanding that CPR actually works and it saves lots of lives and it makes a lot of sense. So that is something similar that we've been working in veterinary medicine ultimately as well, right? Finding the acceptance that this is actually a meaningful intervention. And then, of course, we followed a little bit the inventions and the progresses in the human resuscitation science world as well regarding techniques and all of those things. But that's really how it started. So first from dogs to humans, and then we learned a lot about our resuscitation back from humans. And so it's a forth and back. I think the two kind of really coexisted. And there was really, really early adopters of closed chest compressions. I think the first veterinary paper was maybe 2 years after that initial paper was published. So really, really early as well.
That's amazing. Dan, how did you design the first Recover Guidelines project, and how many people were involved, and how long did that take?
We decided to not try to reinvent the wheel. So there had been a really well-established process in place for decades in human medicine to develop CPR guidelines. And so we had the great good fortune of having Manuel's contacts in the human resuscitation field to really help us figure out how best to do this. And so we really borrowed the process from them using a set of standardized evidence worksheets to assess the literature in CPR, the specific primary literature in CPR that we could then interpret through a different lens. So we used the same approach, but rather than thinking about it as trying to answer a question about CPR in a person, we tried to answer that question in terms of how to do CPR in a dog or a cat. And so we recruited a bunch of volunteers, and we had about 100 people involved the first time around to try to answer a series of questions. We had about 72 questions the first time we did this. And for each question, we looked to see what studies were available out in the literature. We read those studies. The volunteers read the studies. They then tried to answer the question based on that evidence, and then to describe that level of evidence, how strongly did the evidence support the answer that they came up with to the question. And then once we had all of those questions answered to the best of our ability, we took all of that information and wrote specific guidelines that we could use in a clinical setting to describe how best to do CPR in dogs and cats. So, the same basic literature that's used to write the human CPR guidelines, but interpreted it through a different lens. And that led to some differences between the way we do CPR in dogs and cats and the way it's done in humans. So it was a huge project, many, many people involved, and it took us about 2 years to complete that first attempt at writing those guidelines. And those were published back in 2012.
Jamie, were you one of the original contributors to Recover? And if so, what were you expecting as a contributor to this process?
Yeah, I was. So I was one of those evidence evaluators that Dr. Fletcher was just talking about. One of the cats he was chasing, I suppose, they were chasing, and I remember asking them a lot of questions about what I was doing. So I was the evidence evaluator for monitoring 23, PICO question monitoring 23, which was to answer whether or not there was any usefulness in monitoring exhaled carbon dioxide during CPR in dogs and cats. In many ways, it was an easy one because the answer was very clear. The answer was a strong yes. So I was one of the original contributors. I think I was expecting to do some literature searching, which we do as, clinicians, scientists, veterinarians. But what I really hadn't known until I contributed to that process is how little solid information there would be in the species in question and how much we were going to have to infer based on information gathered from other species or from scenarios, for instance, in people, where a lot of the information they have in human beings has to do with cardiac arrest scenarios that are not necessarily particularly directly applicable to dogs and cats, because the most common reasons that a human being might receive CPR or, suddenly die are quite different from those in dogs and cats. And so we had to do a lot of extrapolation. So I think what I was surprised by is how many papers we found, how much literature there was, and then how little we felt we could really use to answer the question in our species. So a lot of what we call indirectness to the application of that literature.
Manu, what were the original outcomes learned from the 2012 Recover Guidelines, and were there any major differences from human healthcare recommendations?
Thanks very much for that question. I think it's a really good one. And, when asked a question, and it's a common one, I think I tend to focus on what they actually are in common. So they are both mammals. And I would say that there's probably more in common than there are really distinct differences for each individual species. And I thought that it was really interesting. And so one of the most important thing that they have in common is the importance of chest compressions, right? Mm-hmm. Like that the quality of chest compressions is really what makes the blood go around. And that is universally true pretty much in any species. Certainly in humans, after 50 years of research, still stands as the most important thing. Mm-hmm. And it's the same in veterinary medicine, really. And then there's differences, right? We have like this unique challenge of different species, different sizes, cats, teeny little kitty cat up to a Great Dane. And so we had to deal with accommodating what we know from physiology to optimize the resuscitation of all of this huge variety of animals. And I think that's probably where the difference lies, right? It's not a one-size-fits-all approach to the same extent that it is applied in humans. So we have different instructions on how to perform chest compressions in cats, in dogs with different shapes of chests, and so forth. But we have a uniform understanding on how we want to tackle that. And that was really one of the major outcomes of our project Recover. The other really important thing, I think, where there's a difference, and this is more holistically speaking, is that we developed an evidence to decision framework that we see through from the very beginning to the end. What that means is that Recover extracts the evidence from the literature and crafts treatment recommendation, then creates the guidelines. But the guidelines would be nothing without having instruments in our hands, right? To give the clinician, empower the clinician to actually use them. And that's where the education comes in. So Recover covers a little bit everything. It does the evidence evaluation, it develops the teaching tools, and then it distributes those teaching tools to make it as easy as possible and as accessible as possible for veterinary professionals to use it. That's very different in humans. In humans, you have like an institution that develops the evidence evaluation. And then it goes out to the respective institutions that do the educational tools. And they are regionally different depending on where you are in the world. Uh-huh. We are like a one-stop shop for all of these type of things. And that's really important because we're so resource restricted, right? Like there's just no way that each country could do this from scratch. It's so labor intense and it's so complicated to build. And I think that was designed like that purposefully, but I think that really contributed to how many people now have access to that material.
Manu, speaking of many people having access to this, tell me a little bit more about the international response with the 2012 Recover. Were you or Dan or Jamie, were you all surprised by that response, or did you expect it?
Quite frankly, we didn't expect anything. Dan and I, we were as naive as you can possibly be. I think we definitely had visions and we were enthusiastic. Like we really wanted to do this, but we didn't really foresee anything in particular. So we were really surprised that it was picked up as well as it did. It was also taken to other regions in the world. And one little thing that maybe I mentioned, that was the first really international thing, was that some of our human friends had good contacts to Japan. So they reached out to the Japanese leader in resuscitation science in the human world. And he then reached out to his veterinary Kerl. And so then he was tasked to create a course in Recover. And so before we knew it, Dan and I were sitting on an airplane going to Japan. And that was in 2013 to deliver the first train-to-trainers courses. And, they printed T-shirts with Recover on it, and it was all pro'd out. And they really embraced it. So it was an interesting experience. And the Japanese were probably some of the earliest adopters of the guidelines, internationally speaking. And now everything is translated into Japanese, and there's Japanese online courses and a whole certification stream there as well. That just as an example. It was a great ride, I guess, across the globe. And the guidelines were translated into 4 different languages early on, and we plan to do that for the current guidelines as well.
Yeah, I was actually on the Veterinary Emergency Critical Care Society board at that time and remember those requests coming in for translations. And I was both surprised, but also just so happy that this information was so important globally for the veterinary community. So, Dan, I know that a project like this needs some really strong and early champions. So tell me about the groups or organizations that have supported this work.
Yeah, I think it's really important that the 3 of us are here representing an organization that is really a collaboration of many, many organizations. I think the initiative itself grew out of two specific organizations, the American College of Veterinary Emergency and Critical Care, which is the certifying organization that Jamie, Manuel, and I are all certified through, and the Veterinary Emergency and Critical Care Society, which is a larger organization of many people, veterinarians and veterinary technicians in the United States and around the world who have an interest in emergency and critical care. And really, since its inception, it's been a collaborative project between those two organizations. I think this dovetails nicely with your question about international acceptance, because I think one of the things that I am continually amazed by is the interest and excitement around the world about these guidelines. And I do think they are unique in veterinary medicine. I think there are lots of things that have been published in veterinary medicine that are consensus statements where a small group of people get together, talk about a problem, and come up with recommendations. But this was really the first time a true evidence evaluation was done on a large scale to try to answer questions. And I think it really did capture the imagination of many veterinary professionals around the world. So organizations like JAVEX, which is the Japanese Veterinary Emergency and Critical Care Society, which actually kind of grew out of Recover, which is really exciting for me. It didn't exist before Recover. The group of people who were very passionate about CPR training actually developed an organization around it, which was exciting. LAVEX, which is Latin American Veterinary Emergency and Critical Care Society, have been huge champions of this effort for many years, and we're very grateful for everything they've done to disseminate this information in South and Central America. And then the European Veterinary Emergency and Critical Care Society, EVEX, again, very, very involved early on and really helping us to get this word out in Europe and to provide trainers in Europe. So we've had, I think, really great success, mostly because of the people who have been so passionate about it. I think about them as our evangelists. They're Apple evangelists who love everything Apple. We have some really remarkably passionate people who are just very excited about this whole approach to doing CPR.
That concludes part 1 of our 2-part series on the Recover 2.0 initiative for veterinary cardiopulmonary resuscitation. Be sure to listen in next time as we continue our conversation. Thank you for listening to today's episode. We hope you enjoyed it and learned a few helpful tips. If you haven't already, I encourage you to subscribe and listen to our previous episodes to hear the many valuable insights and lessons from our past guests. Don't forget to leave a review for today's episode and share with friends. Make sure to follow VCA Animal Hospitals on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram to stay in the loop. For more inspiring stories, visit our website at vcavoice.com.